Hello, I'm David Allen Voiles, the author of the 13th Day of Christmas and Other Tales of Yuletide Horror, and also the host of Tales from the Hearse. Yes, I hope you'll join me on a little dark ride this evening, and hope you like our method of transportation. Yes, this hearse has an interesting history. Now, I used it in ghost tours, in which I would take our customers to various spooky sites around the Asheville area, telling them original tales of horror. I'd like to share some of those stories with you, and I'd like to begin with a story about this very hearse. Now, originally, the hearse was owned and run by a funeral parlor, as you might have expected. Yes, two men ran that business. One's name was Edward Ernest, and his partner's name was Isaiah Kind, or Izzy as he was better known. Izzy Kind. He wasn't. So together, the two men owned the Kind and Ernest funeral home. Well, one day, a couple came to these two men, needing their services for a very tragic situation. It seems that their daughter had died on her wedding day. Can you imagine? Now, it had been a beautiful affair, a gorgeous day, perfectly clear blue sky. Their friends and family had gathered in the small chapel there, and the family, of course, sitting in the seats that were reserved for them up front. Now, the bride had been secured away in the church parlor, where she wouldn't be seen until that grand moment when she would walk down the aisle. Well, as the crowd waited and they listened to the prelude organ music, they noticed that the groom was nowhere to be seen. The time for the wedding came and passed. No bridal march. 5 minutes passed. 10. People were looking at their watches. They turned to look at the family. The family was shrugging, to say, "We don't know." Finally, the bride's father got up. He walked around the side aisles out the front of the church, out and looked up and down both ways of the little street there where the church was situated. Looked up and down, shook his head, seeing nothing. Came back in the church, clearly upset. Well, he waited a little bit more, but then he was determined that he was going to have to go back and have that unpleasant discussion with his daughter to say that apparently there would be no wedding because there was no groom. Well, he did just that. After 5 more minutes, he walked back to the church parlor to have that unpleasant discussion. But when he opened the parlor door, he found there, lying on the floor, his daughter, dead, a vial of poison in her hand. Now, did she think that she just couldn't go on and suffer the humiliation of having been jilted at the altar? Or was it that she just couldn't go on living without the man whom she thought she had loved and whom she thought loved her? Well, we'll never know. Friends of the family contacted the Kind and Ernest funeral home, and Izzy Kind himself made the offer of conducting the funeral services as needed. And the family, not wanting to shop at such a time, of course, took him up on his offer. So Izzy Kind took the bride's body off to the funeral home, and the family went home to grieve. Well, the next morning, who should arrive at the family's home but the young man, the groom? He hadn't stood her up. He'd merely been detained by an whole sequence of unfortunate circumstances that didn't even allow him to make contact with the family to tell them what was going on. And when he learned that his beloved had taken her own life out of the belief that he had jilted her, he was beside himself with grief. He was practically inconsolable. Now, meanwhile, Back at the funeral home, Izzy Kind had that poor girl's body laid out on one of those gurneys ready to perform those gruesome tasks that have to be done before a funeral. But before he could start, he thought he could detect that her chest seemed to rise and fall just the slightest bit. And then, in fact, she gave a great gasp for air. Well, Izzy Kind, not wanting to let this very lucrative opportunity pass through his fingers, he took the very pillow that would have been used to prop up her lovely head in her coffin, and he placed it over her face and smothered her, snuffed out her life. Well, no one was the wiser, and they held the funeral the very next day in the parlor right there in the funeral home. Well, it was a lovely service again. The same friends and family gathering once again for a much sadder occasion. Now, at the close of that service, the driver of the hearse brought it around front for the pallbearers to load the body into the vehicle in order to take it to the graveyard for the graveside service. And they did. But before the driver could pull out, he got a strange request from the groom. That young man asked if he could ride in the back of the hearse with the body on the way to the cemetery. Well, the driver thought, that is a most strange request, and to tell the truth, quite unseemly. But then he thought to himself, well, who am I to judge this poor fellow? He needs to take consolation in whatever form I guess he can take. So he opened the door and let the poor fellow climb in, and off they drove to the graveyard. Well, on the way to the cemetery, the driver began to hear the most disturbing noises coming from the back of the hearse. There was rustling and thumping and all kinds of disturbing noises. A chill went up his spine. And then he thought to himself, no, I'm being silly. There aren't any seats. There weren't seats like there are now, of course, back then, and the poor fellow is probably getting jostled back and forth, just trying to make himself comfortable. Well, when the driver pulled the hearse up into the graveyard, he waited just a bit, and then the pallbearers arrived, and as the family had gathered at the graveside, they came around to the back of the hearse to open the door to retrieve the casket. Well, they were, of course, expecting a body. That's what they were all gathered for, but they were met with a very unpleasant surprise. For now, instead of one body, there were two. Lying on the floor next to the coffin lay the groom, dead as a doornail. His face was frozen in a mask of absolute terror. And the coffin was now open. And the lid, with the white satin lining, it was torn to shreds as if by frantic clawing. Now, the bride lay back in that coffin, actually quite peacefully, but now there was just the hint of a smile on her lips. Did she think that she had perhaps gotten revenge on the man that she believed had jilted her? We'll never know. But what we do believe is this, that her spirit is one of many that haunts this very hearse. What's that? Well, that was interesting. I hope that you'll take another dark ride with me to hear another tale soon. I believe you can exit the hearse quite safely. I might try to avoid that bride if I were you. But remember, as the holidays approach, you can purchase a copy of my collection of Christmas-themed horror stories called The 13th Day of Christmas and Other Tales of Yuletide Horror, all at gestaltmedia.com. See you next time as we take a dark ride to hear tales from the hearse.